Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 64th class in our course. And tonight we are going to do an introduction to the Kitáb-i-Aqdas, the most holy book, the mother book of the Baha'i faith. And I think you'll find it quite interesting. It's certainly interesting to me. And in the Q&A that will follow, I will deal with some relevance of the work to current events, in particular the dreadful events in Texas with the shooting of the children, and how does that relate to Baha'u'llah's vision of the future, because it does. And the same thing as I've mentioned before with the war in the Ukraine. I've already discussed the relevance of Baha'u'llah's writings insofar as the Suri Hakel was concerned, and the exhortation that the countries of the world, or the empires as they were in the day of Baha'u'llah, unite, form a pact of collective security, and prevent any such incursions as is occurring at this moment. As I've said before, when you go through the Aqdas and see the society he is describing, and then you read further the Guardian's expansion on what Baha'u'llah's, or exploration and elucidation and interpretation of what Baha'u'llah has ordained. It's a remarkable thing that he has created. It is organic. It is capable of expansion and complexification without ceasing. So let me get started by sharing my screen. The Most Holy Book, an Introduction. And we're going to spend at least 2 more classes on this work. We're going to deal next week with a subject that is very often discussed regarding the Aqdas, and that is the distinction and the laws between men and women in light of Baha'u'llah's very clear and unambiguous statement that men and women are equal. And then the week after that, a talk based on a paper I gave some years ago on the concept of penology that I feel is modeled in the Aqdas. How do you respond to negative actions, which is always something very important, whether you're raising a child, how do you respond to negative behavior, or whether you're dealing with a society, how do you respond to those who don't join in on your gleeful construction of a united community. So we begin with this lovely picture of the room we've seen before, the corner room that Baha'u'llah occupied when he wrote the Kitáb-i-Aqdas. And we're going to go over a number of introductory things that should prepare you for getting into the Aqdas, and maybe answer some questions you might have had about how it is written, because it's not what you expect. For example, it is organic rather than linear. Now, since it's containing the laws and exhortations and of society, you think it would be highly structured, almost an outline and so forth, but it's not at all. It's rather more like a poem, or as I like to describe it, like jewels in a tapestry. And that is, you're reading along and you have this little, he'll give you an anecdote, and then suddenly he'll drop a law in there that's related to the anecdote or to the analogy. So it's, the structure of it is not at all what you would expect, but it's clearly an intentional deviation from our expectations. So it challenges us in many ways, and it's part of the reason why it took so long to have it authoritatively translated. It is a mixture of laws, ordinances, and exhortations, as well as the abrogation or the nullification of laws and taboos, cultural and religious taboos of the past. So it's not simply laws. And of course, it contains a lot of things that are implicit that the House of Justice and the guardianship would go on and are in the process of enhancing. In effect, it's an organization of, well, let me put it another, it's an organism capable of growth and development. And that will be stated in the later. So what are the differences among these? What's the difference between a law and an ordinance, and between an ordinance and an exhortation? And what is what things are abrogated and where do they come from? And why do these things seem strange in some cases? And that is, some of the laws might seem like it's okay to touch silk or something. What does that have to do with anything? How is it culturally neutral? This is extremely important. And that is, while some people may see certainly a relationship between the laws of the Aqdas and those of the Persian Bayan, of the Bab, and of the laws of Islam, which is not surprising considering each religion will retain some of the laws of the past, change others, expand others. And yet the laws and the culture and the society Baha'u'lláh has created is not oriented towards a Middle Eastern milieu or a point of view in any way. It is able, as we've seen, as we build communities all over the world, we use the same structure, and it works in a small rural village, in a jungle somewhere, and it works in the big city. If you think about it, that's rather remarkable that it is that flexible and that it works in all circumstances. What Baha'u'lláh means by saying this is not a mere code of laws. So that's one reason that might explain why it's not in a form we expect, because it's not just a code of laws. He says, think not we have revealed unto you a mere code of laws, nay, rather we have unsealed the choice wine with the fingers of might and power. And that wine is the Book of Certitude, as I mentioned before. And so you have here these two actions that are reciprocal and that play off of each other in an advancing fashion, and that is knowledge followed by action, neither of which is acceptable without the other. And so you've got the knowledge, the new overview of a new theology and the concept of progressive revelation spelled out in the Book of Certitude. That's the choice wine, and it is unsealed with this book. Now, what does that mean? Well, just to put it in general terms, it means it's put into action. That the new knowledge without a way of implementing that new knowledge and making it available to everyone is useless. So there are several critical dates involved. Of course, it was revealed in 1873, but there, insofar as the translation and making it available to us today, there are several dates you need to be aware of. In 1953, the Guardian included as one of the goals of the 10-year plan the preparation of a synopsis and codification of the laws. Now, this is the very outline that we would expect to see, and the Guardian says, yes, we need that. We need to group them together in categories, in effect, and make basically a chart of how these things would be organized. And so he went about beginning that, but as of his death in 1957, he had not completed it. So this was one of the things the Guardian, there were a number of prerequisites that the Guardian said must be accomplished before there could be a valid translation of the work. And doing the synopsis and codification was one of the first of these. So this task was continued under the House of Justice, and it was completed and released in 1973, which of course was the centenary of the revelation of the Aqdas. And this was the synopsis and codification with explanatory notes as well as a compilation of passages from the Kitáb-i-Aqdas, which the Guardian had already translated. And that book now is part of, so that was the little red book, and that was part of the blue book, which is now part of the blue book, which is the entire Aqdas. Also, the questions and answers tablet, which constitutes an appendix to the Aqdas, and we'll get to that a little more later. And then 1986, the House of Justice decided that the time had come when the preparation for an English translation of the complete text of the Most Holy Book was both possible and essential, and made its accomplishment a goal of the 6-year plan from 1986 to 1992. And its publication in 1992, of course, was the centenary of the passing of Baha'u'lláh. So a very propitious gift in remembrance of Baha'u'lláh. Now, again, though we've talked about it before, and we'll talk about it a little more in depth later, for those of you who weren't in those classes when we discussed this earlier, why English is so important? Why is English so important? Well, English is very nuanced language. It is a very rich language. It is the most rich language in the world, though Arabic, in which the work is written, is also very rich. But the fact is that the House of Justice, as I've said before, when it turns to the works of Baha'u'lláh, it turns to the Guardian's translations of those works, which are authoritative and divinely inspired and infallible, and therefore the House of Justice looks to those rather than to the original work. For reasons that we'll get into, but suffice to say, words that have a cultural context or may be very allusive in Arabic, the Guardian makes very explicit in English, and so did the translation team that worked on this and wrote it according to the Guardian's own style and the Guardian's own use of translation. And I can explain that later in the Q&A. So it was published in 1992, and with several essential supplementary works included. And this would be a compilation of Baha'u'llah's supplementary works to the Most Holy Book, a translation of questions and answers, which was a tablet collected by a Baha'i, and then of questions that would come from believers, and he collected them. And these, the Guardian said this should be included because they're questions about various nuanced understandings of a particular law. The paragraphing was introduced. In Arabic, there is no paragraphing. And so for purposes of reference and putting notes in, you have each paragraph numbered and then the notes put at the end. So this is another addition, the paragraphing with numbers, and then the notes at the end is an addition. And that's the annotation. Shoghi Effendi had stated that the English translation of the Aqdas should be copiously annotated. Now, annotation is a process of simply putting endnotes or footnotes, endnotes in this case, which give further explanation of or writings relevant to a particular discussion in the body of the Aqdas. So, for example, the law of marriage is clarified in the notes, which include Abdul Baha's explanation of what that law means insofar as prescribing monogamy and proscribing polygamy. The policy followed in preparing the notes has been to concentrate on those points which might strike a non-Arabic speaking reader as obscure or which for various reasons require elucidation or background information. They're not intended to be a comprehensive commentary on the text beyond these fundamental requirements. So there are other works in the writings, particularly in the Red Book, that is a collection of Baha'u'llah's works revealed after the Aqdas, the tablets of Baha'u'llah, it's called. And it contains a number of works, like the ornaments and so on, that are meant as reflections on and elucidations and more expansive discussions of particular laws. So what is the significance of the Most Holy Book? Well, I'm going to read you a number of paragraphs. Now, this is from the introductory matter that's in the book itself. So you can get this from the slides, but you can also get it from the book. I thought I could do no better than quote from the House of, this is written by the House of Justice, and I presume that they did a much better job than I could ever do. Of the more than 100 volumes comprising the sacred writings of Baha'u'llah, the Kitáb-i-Aqdas is of unique importance. To build anew the whole world is the claim and challenge of its message, of his message. And the Kitáb-i-Aqdas is the charter of the future world civilization that Baha'u'llah has come to raise up. Its provisions rest squarely on the foundation established by past religions. For in the words of Baha'u'llah, this is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. In this revelation, the concepts of the past are brought to a new level of understanding, and the social laws, changed to suit the age now dawning, are designed to carry humanity forward into a world civilization, the splendors of which can as yet be scarcely imagined. Now, one of the things, of course, you will notice is only a certain number of the laws are currently implemented. They will be implemented as the House of Justice thinks it is fit to do so for a particular clime or a particular place or a particular time in the advancement of civilization. So, for example, it has been during my time as a Baha'i that the law of authoritatively, which was enforced on the Eastern believers, became enforced on the Western believers. In its affirmation of the validity of the great religions of the past, the Kitáb-i-Aqdas reiterates those eternal truths enunciated by all the divine messengers: the unity of God, love of one's neighbor, and the moral purpose of earthly life. At the same time, it removes those elements of past religious codes that now constitute obstacles to the emerging unification of the world and the reconstruction of human society. And some of those are the things that have been, as said, have been abrogated, which were either based on other religious teachings or in many cases erroneous inferences in those religions, or things that were appropriate at one time and are no longer appropriate or needful. The law of God for this dispensation addresses the needs of the entire human family. There are laws in the Kitáb-i-Aqdas which are directed primarily to the members of a specific section of humanity and can be immediately understood by them, but which at first reading may be obscure to people of a different culture. Such, for example, is the law of prohibiting the confession of sins to a fellow human being, which, though understandable to those of Christian background, may puzzle others. Many laws relate to one of those past dispensations, especially the two most recent ones, those of Muhammad and the Bab, embodied in the Quran and in the Bayan. Nevertheless, although certain ordinances of the Aqdas have such a focused reference, they also have universal implications. Through his law, Baha'u'llah gradually unveils the significance of the new levels of knowledge and behavior to which the peoples of the world are being called. He embeds his precepts in a setting of spiritual commentary, and this is dealing with the structure that I was alluding to, keeping ever before the mind of the reader the principle that these laws, no matter the subject with which they deal, serve the manifold purposes of bringing tranquility to human society, raising the standard of human behavior, increasing the range of human understanding, and spiritualizing the life of each and all. Throughout, it is the relationship of the individual soul to God and the fulfillment of its spiritual destiny that is the ultimate aim of the laws of religion. Think not, is Baha'u'llah's own assertion, that we have revealed unto you a mere code of laws. Nay, rather, we have unsealed the choice wine with the fingers of might and power. His book of laws is his weightiest testimony unto all people, and the proof of the all-merciful unto all who are in heaven and on earth. Now, we have in the Aqdas the establishment of and the preparation for the future of two branches of the governmental institution that the faith, administrative order of the faith is, and that the governance it will become. One is interpretive and one legislative. One is the branch of of learning, and the other are the branch of the rulers, the learned and the rulers, Baha'u'llah calls them in the Aqdas. He uses those two terms. And of course, he designates Abdul-Baha to be both of these during his lifetime. He is both the authoritative and infallible interpreter of the Aqdas and the other text of Baha'u'llah. And he is also the head of the faith. And so we were during the ministry of Abdul-Baha to turn all our questions to the master. This unique figure is at once the exemplar or the pattern of life taught by his father. He is the divinely inspired authoritative interpreter of his teachings. He is the center and pivot of the covenant. In other words, the authority for everything that should occur during his ministry and after his ministry, which the author of the Baha'i revelation made with all who recognize him. The 36 years of the Guardian's ministry, where he, like Abdul-Baha, served in two of these same capacities. So like Abdul-Baha, during the life of the Guardian, both institutions of the learned and the executive were embodied in the capacity, the station of the Guardian. The divinely inspired authoritative interpreter of his teachings and the administrative head of the cause. Then with the election of the House of Justice in 1963, you had the administrative body, but what happened to the learned? Well, you still had the guardianship, even if you didn't have a living guardian. So you still had the twin branches, and the branches now, of course, of the learned are occupied by the International Teaching Center, which has under it the Continental Councils, which have under them the auxiliary board members, and under them the assistants. Now, the administrative body is head of the faith, elected through secret ballot and plurality vote in a three-stage election by adult Baha'is throughout the world. And of course, we've studied that when we talked about the will and testament of Abdul-Baha. The revealed word of, and we'll study it again, the revealed word of Baha'u'llah, together with the interpretations and expositions of the center of the covenant and the guardian of the cause, constitute the binding terms of reference of the Universal House of Justice and are its bedrock foundation. Now, the House of Justice does not have the authority to give interpretation of the text, but it does have the authority to bring about new laws, to elucidate the laws and teachings and interpretations, and to implement those laws as it sees fit. And of course, I think I just mentioned to create new laws when they are needed, so long as they don't conflict with the established laws of Baha'u'llah. The laws themselves govern three areas: the individual's relationship to God, the physical and spiritual matters which benefit the individual directly. This would be like things like cleanliness and moral behavior within the family, within the community, and so on. Relations among individuals and between the individual and society. So these are the three areas then: the relationship to God, the individual, and the individual in his relationship to others in the family, in the community, and society as a whole. They can be grouped under the following headings: prayer and fasting, laws of personal status governing marriage, divorce, and inheritance, a range of other laws, ordinances, and prohibitions, as well as exhortations, and the abrogation of specific laws and ordinances of previous dispensations. So what is the basis for laws to come? How will they grow out of? In other words, the Aqdas is not frozen in time. It is the basis for all the laws that will come afterward. And both by providing an institution capable of making those laws, but also providing a administrative order and a text which encourages the creation of laws and the implementation of those laws, as well as a pattern, as I hope to discuss in class after next, how to respond to violations of law. They constitute the kernel of a vast range of law that will rise in centuries to come. This elaboration of the law will be enacted by the Universal House of Justice under the authority conferred upon it by Baha'u'lláh himself. In one of his tablets, Abdul-Baha elucidates this principle. Now notice this term elucidate as opposed to interpret. We're going to discuss that in the Q&A a bit, but suffice it to say, there is a difference between the two, but it's very subtle. So here's how Abdul-Baha elucidates the principle. Those matters of major importance which constitute the foundation of the law of God are explicitly recorded in the text, but subsidiary laws are left to the House of Justice. Now, subsidiary to the major laws are to areas which may come and go. So in other words, they can create a law as it's needed, and then they can abrogate their own law. They can't abrogate the laws of Baha'u'lláh. Those are for the whole dispensation. But if they create a law because of some exigency that arises, such as a pandemic, for example, then they can change that law when circumstances change. The wisdom of this is that the times never remain the same, for change is a necessary quality and an essential attribute of this world and of time and place. So the laws may change in a particular area. Therefore, the House of Justice will take action accordingly. So the wisdom of this organic process, and so you see it is a process, it is a living thing, if you will, not some frozen set of laws. And that's what's surprising, is you would think there would be, that it would, and people during my lifetime as a Baha'i, until this was revealed, until it was translated in '92, we had no idea what it was going to look like, how many laws there were. I had word from some of the Persian friends who read Arabic and so on that it wasn't very big, but I thought it would be totally different in its structure, its style, and the number of laws. Briefly, this is the wisdom of referring the laws of society to the House of Justice. In the religion of Islam, now listen to this carefully because this is an important sequence of thought to follow. In the religion of Islam, similarly, not every ordinance was explicitly revealed by Muhammad, nay, not a 10th part of a 10th part was included in the text. Although all matters of major importance were specifically referred to, there were undoubtedly thousands of laws which were unspecified. These were devised by the divines of a later age according to the laws of Islamic jurisprudence, and individual divines made conflicting deductions from the original revealed ordinances. All of these were enforced. So in other words, you had a problem, and of course we've discussed that problem at length. I do have an article that I've written that will be coming out with hopefully in the next year on the whole matter of the history of the breach in the covenant of Muhammad, which brought about this problem of so many of Islamic jurisprudence, where instead of following the imams and whatever jurisprudence they would have established, the imams were sequentially murdered, slaughtered by the Sunni sect of Islam. In this day, the House of Justice serves this function. In other words, they are the ones to whom you turn your questions. So let me look back at this. I went over that. In other words, in the past, you would refer these matters which were hinted at or dealt with in general by the law, but not specifically for particular situations. You would refer them to whoever happened to be in power, insofar as the most highly regarded divine or cleric in a particular area, in a particular sect, and according to their particular inclination. That's why you have these laws regarding women, for example, that bear no, well, they bear a reference to something Muhammad said, namely women should dress modestly. That's it. And from that, you have what you have going on in Afghanistan now, which is totally baseless insofar as anything Muhammad taught or anything the imams taught. In this day, the House of Justice then will serve the function of multiplying the laws, applying them, implementing them, elucidating them. By that, we mean giving light to. That's what the word comes from. Today, this process of deduction is the right of the body of the House of Justice, and the deductions and conclusions of individual learned men have no authority unless they are endorsed by the House of Justice, and meaning unless the conclusions are endorsed. In other words, there are no individuals of authority in the Baha'i faith anymore, nor will they be for the rest of this dispensation. Only groups of bodies, the ultimate one of which, of course, is elected by this three-tiered election, have authority. So the deductions and conclusions of the learned. Now, this became very important at several points in the history of the recent history of the Baha'i faith, where you had some particular Baha'is who were learned in both Middle Eastern studies and Islam, Islamic law and jurisprudence, and in translation of the text and so forth, and thought that they had more of, or at least as much right to give a learned interpretation of what Baha'u'lláh meant than did the House of Justice, which of course is directly in opposition to the statement of Baha'u'lláh and has explicitly borne out and explained in detail by Abdul Baha in his Will and Testament. The difference is precisely this, that from the conclusions and endorsements of the body of the House of Justice, whose members are elected by and known to the worldwide Baha'i community, no differences will arise. That doesn't mean they can't have consultation where they differ with each other until they come to a conclusion, but once they have come to a conclusion, there are no differences. Whereas the conclusions of individual divines and scholars would definitely lead to differences and result in schism, division, and dispersion, which of course is exactly what has happened in the past. The oneness of the word would be destroyed, the unity of the faith would disappear, and the edifice of the faith of God would be shaken. Although the Universal House of Justice is explicitly authorized to change or repeal its own legislation as conditions change, thus providing Baha'i law with an essential element of flexibility, it cannot abrogate or change any of the laws which are explicitly laid down in the sacred text. The society for which certain of the laws of the Aqdas are designed will come only gradually into being, and Baha'u'llah has provided for the progressive application of Baha'i law. Indeed, the laws of God are like unto the ocean, and the children of men as fish, did they but know it. However, in observing them, one must exercise tact and wisdom. Since most of the people are feeble and far removed from the purpose of God, therefore one must observe tact and prudence under all conditions, so that nothing might happen that could cause disturbance and dissension or raise clamor among the heedless. One must guide mankind to the ocean of true understanding in a spirit of love and tolerance. The Kitáb-i-Aqdas itself beareth eloquent testimony to the loving providence of God. So the principle of progressive application, what is that? And the Universal House of Justice in the introduction to the Aqdas quotes from a letter Shoghi Effendi wrote in 1935 to a National Spiritual Assembly about what this means. The laws revealed by Baha'u'llah in the Aqdas are, whenever practicable and not in direct conflict with the civil law of the land, absolutely binding on every believer or Baha'i institution, whether in the East or in the West. Certain laws should be regarded by all believers as universally and vitally applicable at the present time. Others have been formulated in anticipation of a state of society destined to emerge from the chaotic conditions that prevail today. And I'm fond of giving the example of the fact that one of the penalties for being a thief, the third level of response, if you will, the most extreme measure is that the thief who is a recidivist, a repeat offender, at some point, the community may have a mark put on the forehead of the individual to indicate to those with whom he or she comes in contact, they are not to be trusted. Well, today, of course, we have, the gangster with tattoos all over his or her body, and the teardrop symbol in prison if you've killed someone is a mark of honor and glory. So this would hardly work in society. So that presumes a society where being known as a thief would not be a good thing and not be something to be proud of. Well, that's maybe not the best example, but it's an example of a law that will become applicable and workable and enforceable and useful only when society has attained a certain level of progress and unity and coherence with regarding the expectations of society, regarding the moral behavior of its individuals. What has not been formulated in the Aqdas, in addition to matters of detail and of secondary importance arising out of the application of the laws already formulated by Baha'u'llah, will have to be enacted by the House of Justice. So in other words, in addition to other laws related to a particular law, how the law will be applied and put into effect, that's going to have to be determined by the House of Justice. So there's a lot more that the amount the House of Justice has to do is quite immense. And the Guardian makes this clear in many of his writings, where he says he gives certain opinions on things, but then will end up saying, but it will be up to the House of Justice to make a final decision on this matter. So he does not presume in many instances to say what should happen himself, because he knows that it's not the time for him, that this, what should be done at that time will be known only by the House of Justice. This body can supplement but never invalidate or modify in the least degree what has already been formulated by Baha'u'lláh, nor has the guardian any right whatsoever to lessen the binding effect, much less to abrogate the provisions of so fundamental and sacred a book. So the guardian could, as I said, he served both functions, but that is, he was the administrative head of the faith, but he did not have the authority to make law. Now, of course, it was designed in the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha that the guardian, in addition to being the guardian and therefore the authoritative interpreter of the word, would be the president or convener of the House of Justice. But he would have, had he lived that long, not have had any more authority than any of the other members of that. He would simply have been the convener. So he would have had no individual authority on that body, nor does any other member have more than another, than one another. The principle governing this progressive application was enunciated in a letter on behalf of the guardian. I already said that. The laws revealed, so here is what he said. The laws revealed by Baha'u'lláh and the Aqdas are, oh, wait a minute, did I just read that? Application of the laws. Yes, I've already read that, haven't I? The number of laws, I think I did. If I didn't, we'll read it later. The number of laws binding on Baha'is is not increased by the publication of this translation. So in other words, the fact that you have the laws in front of you doesn't mean that you have to abide by them, though some of them you might want to, give it a try if they don't seem too bizarre. And some of them we can talk about during the Q&A. And we'll certainly talk about some of the specific laws in the next couple of classes. When it is deemed timely, the Baha'i community will be advised which additional laws are binding upon believers, and any guidance or supplementary legislation necessary for their application will be provided. Well, the tablets revealed after the Aqdas, of course, are, as I said, in that collection. The formulation by Baha'u'lláh in his Kitáb-i-Aqdas of his fundamental laws of his dispensation was followed, as his mission drew to a close, by the enunciation of certain precepts and principles which lie at the very core of his faith, by the reaffirmation of truths he had previously proclaimed, by the elaboration and elucidation of the laws he had already laid down. And these are the works, as I said, are in not all of the works in that are aimed at that, but most of them are. So you have the Tajaliyat and so on. But by the revelation of further prophecies and warnings, and by the establishment of subsidiary ordinances designed to supplement the provisions of his most holy book. These were recorded in unnumbered tablets, which he continued to reveal into the last days of his earthly life. And we'll look at some of those after we get through with the Aqdas. Among these works is the questions and answers. Now, this compilation made by Januli Mukarabin, the most eminent scholar of the transcribers of Baha'u'llah's writings, consisting of answers revealed by Baha'u'llah to questions put to him by various believers. It constitutes an invaluable appendix to the Aqdas, and of course is included in it. So you really have about, 5 or 6 different things in the Aqdas. You have the introduction, you have the quote, the translation of the passages that the guardian had translated himself. You have the Aqdas, you have questions and answers, you have the notes. You have an incredible index, by the way. The index is most valuable. In 1978, the most noteworthy of the other tablets of this nature were published in English as a compilation entitled Tablets of Baha'u'lláh Revealed After the Kitáb-i-Aqdas. Some years after the revelation of the Kitáb-i-Aqdas, Baha'u'lláh had manuscript copies, now this is of the Aqdas, sent to Baha'is in Iran, and in the year 1890 and 91, towards the end of his life, he arranged for the publication of the original Arabic text of the book in Bombay. Why Arabic, and why is it so challenging to translate? A word should be said about the style of language which the Kitáb-i-Aqdas has been rendered into English, the style in which it has been rendered into English. Baha'u'lláh enjoyed a superb mastery of Arabic and preferred to use it in those tablets and other writings where its precision of meaning was particularly appropriate to the exposition of basic principle. Now, we've discussed this when we discussed the difference between the hidden words that are in Arabic, the first part of the hidden words, and the hidden words that are in Persian. The ones in Arabic are very straightforward, very little imagery, and very specific. Where the teachings in the guidance and so forth in the Persian hidden words are very imagistic, beautiful poetry, but sometimes very abstruse because they are so imagistic. But Arabic is not, you can use metaphor and you can use all other sorts of figurative language in Arabic. But the point is the language itself is much richer than Persian, and therefore he chose to use that for precision. And of course, a book of law should be precise. Beyond the choice of language itself, however, the style employed is of an exalted and emotive character, not at all what you expect. Immensely compelling, particularly to those familiar with the great literary tradition out of which it arose. I've heard some people say, well, he wrote it at different times and it was just sort of patched together. I don't think that's the case. It's the way it is because it was intended to be the way it is. And there's, I wish we had time to do a thorough examination of it insofar as the style is concerned, but we will deal with some of that about how the law is in the context of a discussion about something else. And you wonder, well, that doesn't make sense. Why does it? But if you study it hard enough, you'll see why it is where it is and how it is, how what precedes it leads up to it and how what follows it derives from it. In taking up his task of translation, Shoghi Effendi faced the challenge of finding an English style which would not only faithfully convey the exactness of the text meaning, but would also evoke in the reader the spirit of meditative reverence, which is a distinguishing feature of response to the original. So if it were just the codification, which we did have earlier, you wouldn't have the kind of spiritual impact that this meditative language of it has. The form of expression he selected, excuse me, let me have a sip of tea. The form of expression he selected, reminiscent of the style used in the 17th century translators of the Bible, and this would be the King James Bible, captures the elevated mode of Baha'u'llah's Arabic while remaining accessible to the contemporary reader. His translations, moreover, are illumined by his uniquely inspired understanding of the purport and implications of the original. Now, that last part there, if you're wondering about the translation and how it takes place of the authoritative text, this is extremely important, that he was aware of the intended meaning. That phrase, intended meaning, is so important. In other words, it's one thing if you're translating from, say, Italian to Spanish and so on. You won't have much trouble. But if you're dealing with poetry, even if you're translating from romantic languages to another romantic language, you still have the problem of maybe you can use the same simile or metaphor. But in widely different languages and cultures, you've got to know, well, what exactly does it say, but what does it mean? So the right word I choose will represent the intended meaning that the Baha'u'lláh is trying to get across here. And of course, only someone with unchallengeable authority like Shoghi Effendi could do this. At the same time, it is vital to avoid extrapolating this process to the point where it would be add unjustifiably to the original or limit its meaning. Striking the right balance between beauty and clarity of expression on the one hand, and literalness on the other, is one of the major issues with which the translators have had to grapple, and which has caused repeated reconsideration of the rendering of certain passages. Another major issue is the legal implication of certain Arabic terms, which have a range of meanings different from those of similar English terms. And of course, we will see that when we discuss the violation of the law of adultery, which is not meaning adultery. It's really, as the notes tell you, it means sexual intercourse outside marriage of any sort. Sacred scripture clearly requires special care and faithfulness in translation. This is supremely important in the case of a book of laws, where it is vital that the reader not be misled or drawn into fruitless disputation. And so where you get to the discussion we'll have next class of the laws that seem to differentiate between men and women in some regards. How is that not diminishing the status of women? Well, we'll get to that. As had been foreseen, the translation of the Most Holy Book has been a work of the utmost difficulty, requiring consultation with experts in many lands. Since 1/3 of the, excuse me, of the text had already been translated by Shoghi Effendi, it was necessary to strive for three qualities in the translation of the remaining passages: accuracy of meaning, beauty of English, and conformity of style with that used by Shoghi Effendi. And during the Q&A, I can maybe, if you're interested, further describe to you how that is done. The closing point then by the House of Justice is this: we are now satisfied that the translation has reached a point where it represents an acceptable rendering of the original. Now notice acceptable. Nevertheless, it will undoubtedly give rise to questions and suggestions which may shed further light on its content. We are profoundly grateful for the assiduous and meticulous labors of the members of the committees whom we commissioned to prepare and review this translation of the Aqdas and to compose the annotations. We are confident that this first authorized English edition of the Aqdas will enable its readers to obtain at least an inkling of the splendor of the mother book of the Baha'i dispensation. So let me stop there and we'll have the Q&A.